Washington, D.C. is my home away from home. I've worked here for the better part of 3 decades as a founder, entrepreneur, policy expert, and author.
Probably the longest title. Everybody sort of shortened it to ONC for sanity's sake.
Mercifully.
Yeah, mercifully.
I've learned leadership secrets from many healthcare executives who understand that Washington is the largest payer and regulator of healthcare.
She said, well, because you'll never get a husband if you do that.
I began interviewing healthcare leaders many years ago because what better way to learn how they think, why they make it to the top, and how they remained there. Think about what was your most challenging engagement.
Healthcare has been the most difficult problem, I think. Let me just say that.
We'll talk about that later. Are you an innovator or looking for a competitive edge? Then you're listening to the right conversation. Competition in today's world is more and more complicated as the distinction between previously separate business sectors becomes blurred. We met with Professor Ron Adner to discuss his newest book, Winning the Right Game. Ron analyzes business strategy, beginning with the ecosystem within which the business operates. Businesses need to consider not just products and services they deliver to customers, but also structures of interdependence built into their ecosystem. We discussed how firms can better prepare for or even cause ecosystem disruption and how different leadership styles are necessary for different settings. We dive into the complexities of healthcare innovation and the limits of the words we use. Ron rounds out the conversation with advice for up-and-coming leaders navigating the modern ecosystems and offering counsel to young innovators on how to bring good ideas to scale. Well, good morning, Ron, and welcome.
Thank you, Gary. It's great to be here.
We're pleased to have you at the microphone. Of course, you're up in New Hampshire today. We're down in the Washington, D.C. area. It's fall time, or at least it's close to it. Are the leaves turning yet in New Hampshire?
It's coming up, and I got to tell you, it's beautiful.
The Gary Bisbee Show, as you know, Ron, is about the power of questions for healthcare leaders. You're a top-notch strategist, professor at the Tuck School at Dartmouth, author, and authored, of course, The Wide Lens, which is just a classic thinking on entrepreneurship and innovation and competition. And congratulations. Winning the Right Game is the newest entry here, just recently published, and we're excited to talk to you about that today. I'm sure this is going to prove to be absolutely classic thinking about innovation, entrepreneurship, the ecosystem. So let me ask you a question about yourself first, which is, how did you become interested in leaders and strategy, Ron?
I got interested in strategy basically by becoming very concerned about what it was that I was about to do. So my undergraduate training was in engineering, and I got into engineering because I was really interested in innovation. And very early on, I had a sneaking suspicion that there were a lot of bottlenecks to the success of innovation that had nothing to do with engineering. And so I ended up deciding that I needed to understand how to see the big picture before diving into any technical piece. And that ended up taking me on a journey from engineering to doing a Ph.D. at a business school to basically what my career has become, which is trying to understand innovation through a strategy lens.
I have a very tactical question, and then we'll get into winning the right game. And that is, I like to ask all of our author guests, how do you come up with your names for your books? The Wide Lens, Winning the Right Game. Those are terrific names. How do you do that, Ron?
Both were really long searches, actually. Right? So like the idea behind each book was well established. In fact, many years before the book came out, right? I do a lot of my thinking and experimentation within my research and research presentations in my classroom. I'm very, very fortunate to have spectacular students who are willing to humor me as I try to develop new ideas. But the search for the title in both cases, really, it was trying to triangulate on how do you encapsulate a message of a book that you understand it before you read it, and then it summarizes after. And both essentially, I think, capture the essence of each book, right? Wide Lens was about how to see the big picture when you innovate. And then this new book, Winning the Right Game, is really about this question of not how do you innovate, but how do you compete in a world where innovation and value creation takes on this more composed form within ecosystems. And what the title is actually supposed to evoke, Winning the Right Game, is this notion that it's no longer just about winning. I mean, we're old enough to remember when Jack Welch was regarded as the greatest CEO in the world, and he had this great book that he wrote called Winning. And, in some ways it was that simple, right? That was good advice. Just win, right? Do it better than the other guy, do it cheaper than the other guy. And today's world is more complicated, where, just winning is not enough. There are multiple games being played. You need to choose your game. You need to understand the games being played by others around you. And so this notion of winning the right game is supposed to evoke the fact that, you could be winning the wrong game, and how do you be careful about your choices? And that actually changes our whole approach to strategy in this world.
Well, this broader look at the world, the term you use is ecosystem. Can you define that for us, Ron, for those that might not be sure exactly what that means?
Yeah, actually, I think it's a fair question. I actually do it. I offer some formal definitions at the beginning of this book, because you cannot be in healthcare and not be exposed to the word ecosystems 8 times a day. But my contention is that 90% of the time, if you took the word ecosystem out of the sentence and replaced it with the word mishmash, nothing would really change in that sentence. And so what it means, of course, is that people are very concerned about the mishmash in a new way, right? That we're sensitive to interdependence. But it also means that beyond that, we don't know what to do with it. So in my work, actually, this is going back 20 years now. The way I think about ecosystems is that it's not just about interdependence. And we can talk about that, how in fact, industries are defined by huge amounts of interdependence. Really what makes the ecosystem construct matter is that it's the structure of interdependence among a multiplicity of partners, right? That there's a multilateral game being played. And that the way to think about that structure is to root it in the notion of the new value that you're trying to create. Right, so I actually have my one sentence definition of what is an ecosystem is that an ecosystem is defined by the structure to which partners interact to deliver a value proposition to the end consumer. And if you unpack that, you can start thinking about, well, what's changing as I'm trying to deliver a new value proposition? And that's how you surface the structure of the ecosystem. And it's once you have that idea of structure that you can actually begin to build strategies for alignment, for offense, for defense, et cetera. So structure is at the heart of it.
So we're thinking about ecosystem and structure. Now you introduce the term value proposition. Ron, how would you define that?
So the value proposition is the thing that you're trying to deliver. And the reason it's important to highlight is because the value that you're trying to deliver sometimes is just fully dependent on what it is that you do. But often it's not, right? Often it's dependent on other participants. And so by anchoring the ecosystem in the deliverable at the end, you become more sensitive to the other parties that you need to work with, or the changes in the way you need to work with those parties in pursuit of one value proposition as opposed to another. And so really it's supposed to defocus you from just focusing on your product or your service and thinking about this arrangement of partnerships on which you're going to rely.
There's a lot of discussion in healthcare about this, of course, the value proposition, and that is the patient receiving affordable care? Are they happy with their care? Is it kind of appropriate care? Does that fit within the context of the value proposition as you outline it?
Yes, right. I mean, it's in some ways, I think one of the greatest challenges in healthcare at this moment is that we're having this debate about, well, what is value, right? And these different interpretations, each, in fact, requires something new, not just of a particular actor, let's say the healthcare system, but they're demanding a new set of interactions. So, when we talk about value-based healthcare, for example, right? If you, at a superficial level, it says, okay, you're moving away from fee-for-service to delivering some kind of longer version of care. And it's usually coupled with some capitated payment. so that you're not charging per service, you're charging per, life under coverage. If that was all it was, it would be pretty straightforward. It would be hard, but it would be straightforward. The issue is, as you start peeling away from there, suddenly the activities and the partnerships required to support this go way beyond the walls of the hospital, right? Not only do they create new interactions within the hospitals between primary cares and specialists and preventions, et cetera, but now you're going out into the community. Suddenly, you need to start thinking about incorporating issues around nutrition and access to healthy food. And, there are healthcare systems that have gone into the renovation business, right? It's cheaper to tear out carpeting in my house than to deal with the consequences of mold on my asthma. And so this is a totally new structure of relationships. And so unpacking those relationships then allows you to create the strategy for how do you deliver the value proposition. And by the way, when you think about what are the realistic interactions that you can do at scale, it also helps you hone in on what's the value proposition you're really trying to get after.
Well, let's take that to the next step, which is how do you relate ecosystem to value proposition? I mean, you've kind of talked about that, but let me ask that question directly.
So the ecosystem is the structure of interdependence that comes together to deliver that value proposition. And there's the question of, well, so what is it that you need to do? There's the question of what is it that others need to do? But the heart of ecosystem strategy is alignment, right? So ecosystem strategy is alignment strategies. How do you get all these parties, not just to show up at the same table, but to agree on how they're going to interact? Right. And that's the core. Anybody who's talking about an ecosystem strategy, if they're not talking about alignment, I think they're missing the game. Right. Essentially what they're doing is they're focusing on a really shiny goal, but they're missing the critical issue of, well, what's the pathway to get there?
Well, of course, in healthcare, the classic case there is the alignment between physicians and hospitals or the delivery system. And there's a lot of work going on trying to figure out what is the right structure, what's the right payment model that would align these two parties, this physician decision maker and the hospital and nursing and all that entails. Does that fit into the model that we're talking about here, Ron?
It certainly does. And in some ways, what makes it challenging is that, there's no one size fits all answer. Right? Depending on who you are as an actor, the levers available to you, the resources available to you, the existing partnerships you can bring into play vary. And so in that regard, ecosystem strategies really are much more customized to a given system than, the way we usually think about an industry strategy. Where basically, again, back to this idea of it was just about winning. Can you deliver lower cost care? Can you deliver, higher quality care? Now it's how do you define care? And as you come up with that definition, to your point, the way you're interacting with different parties, including your physicians, needs to be rethought.
Right, for sure. And it's all about the consumer as we think about it. And if you think about Starbucks, let's say, you can go to any Starbucks, presumably in the world, and get the same kind of brand of coffee and type of coffee that you want, and yet healthcare isn't as focused on a consumer, strangely enough, at least if you look at the ecosystem treating these patients. So that's a huge challenge for healthcare, but it sounds like it fits right exactly into the thinking that you have here in winning the right game.
Yes. And look, in order to deal with this, we need a new set of tools. We need a new language to be able to express this variation. And so that's really the effort in the book. It's not to tell the reader, hey, you didn't notice, but the world is complicated, right? That's not news, right? The challenge is how do you deal with that complexity? And, my journey in writing the book was really in trying to figure out not just the concepts and the frameworks that, will allow someone to come up with better answers, but just as critically, and this was like a big learning for me over the last 10 years, is that the value of these concepts is even more in their role as a language that allows teams to communicate among each other and with their partners than with just the notion of getting to the right answer. Right? I tell this to my students all the time, which is if you're in a classroom and you're the only person with the right answer, good for you. If you're in a meeting room and you're the only person with the right answer, at best, you're just annoying, right? Your job is to bring everybody to the right answer. And that requires this language. And this new complex challenge requires new language. And that's really a big part of what this effort was about.
Well, we've talked about winning the right game. What's an example of a company that's winning the wrong game?
So chapter 1 of the book actually is titled "Winning the Wrong Game is Losing." And so from the book, the highlight is the story of Kodak, which turns out to be one of the most misunderstood failures in, the modern business canon, right? Everybody says, oh, Kodak went bankrupt because they couldn't do the hard transition from chemical to digital. They were stuck in the legacy business, et cetera. And, bad, lazy, inert management, that's what drove them off a cliff. And that turns out to be 100% false. And that falsehood is going to matter both for Kodak's legacy, but much more importantly for the lessons we try to draw from it. So it turns out that Kodak, starting in 2000, went all in on digital, and by the end of the decade, had been the number one seller of digital cameras in America. They were, a total contender in selling printers. Even today, if you go to a CVS or a Walgreens, you see their digital printing kiosks there, right? So it became a leading digital printing company. So it won that game. It did what everybody said they couldn't do. But the thing, they still go bankrupt. And the reason is that just as they're mastering digital printing, the notion of digital printing itself is replaced by digital viewing, right? So it's screens that replace paper, and suddenly this huge effort to dominate digital printing amounts to nothing, right? So Kodak wins, but they win the wrong game. And that's the same. In some ways, it's even worse than losing because they did all that hard work. Right? They could have been asleep for 10 years and maybe have, a greater return to their employees and their shareholders. So, and it's a perfect example of a problem that happens when we start looking at change in the world and focusing at the level of, which is how we usually focus, the level of technologies, the level of activities, right? So this is what I put under the bucket of, what I now call classic disruption, right? So you can think about, kind of the healthcare exemplar of classic disruption was Minute Clinic, right? It was basically, I look at what you do in an ER and I make it, worse, but good enough. And as long as it's cheaper, that's competitive. So that's one kind of threat that, one sees in the environment. That's classic disruption. Just kind of reconfiguring how we do the activities. If you look at CVS Health, where now you have, okay, there's Minute Clinic, but it's coupled with a retail pharmacy that 90% of the population is within like 8 miles of, and you put that in with a giant health insurer, and you put that in with a giant pharmacy benefits manager, suddenly you can see that if those are kept as 4 silos, okay, no big deal. But if they're woven together in the way that their former CEO Mary Merlo had this great phrase, which is we're going after the retailization of healthcare. Right? That's a totally different proposition. To make that happen requires a different approach to strategy. And by the way, to respond to that happening is going to require a very different approach on anybody who feels like they might be put on the defense from that.
You've talked about the playbook for strategy in the book. How do you describe that playbook for strategy, Ron?
All right. So the playbook starts with, how do you understand what an ecosystem is? How do you understand the structure? And I introduced this new construct, this new level of analysis that actually is, I think, essential for understanding how to interpret these kinds of changes in your world. This is something I call your value architecture. And your value architecture is not about how do you run your activities. It's when you think about that value proposition, how do you think about what underlies it? And essentially, this is something that is implicit in most organizations. And what happens is usually the way we think about how we create the value proposition just kind of correlates to how we organize our activities. And that kind of puts you in a mindset that will only identify these classic disruption threats. Whereas looking through this lens of your elements allows you to see interactions that go across the vertical, the siloed boxes. So the first part of the playbook is to really understand how to think about ecosystems. And then with that in place, you can now talk about, well, how do you disrupt? How do you construct new ecosystems? How do you construct new value propositions? And how do you see that happening? And then, of course, there's a question of, okay, if someone is doing that in your space, how do you want to respond? Right. So there's a chapter on ecosystem offense, and then there's a probably even more critical chapter on ecosystem defense, where in both cases, the root is not just how do you come up with your idea, right? I mean, healthcare, we're drowning in great ideas, right? We've been drowning in great ideas for 20 years. The issue is how do we construct, in the case of offense, or maintain and reconfigure in the case of defense? How do we change these coalitions in order to drive forward this new proposition? Next comes the question of timing, right? I mean, we're living now in hopefully the later stages of our COVID world. It certainly feels a lot better than a year ago. But timing disruption is not just about how do you not be too late. A lot of it is how do you not be too early, right? I mean, telehealth has been a too early proposition for 15, 20 years. And now, the conditions have come together and we're in a totally different world. So a critical part of this playbook has to do with timing and try to understand the transition between the old ecosystem and the new ecosystem. The next part is about how do you pick your roles. And then the final part is how do you then pick your leaders and what it is that leaders in these organizations need to do, and how does that change in an ecosystem world compared to a more traditional world?
Well, let's go back to offense and defense. What's an example of a company that we might know the name of that has done a terrific job on offense or a terrific job on defense?
One of the examples in the book is about how Amazon comes out of really nowhere in 2014, right? When Amazon is still regarded as a retailer, not a tech player, and is able to navigate over the course of 5-6 years to become the central player in the smart home. It's really pretty remarkable, right? I mean, they beat Google, they beat Apple, they beat Microsoft, which are these giant ecosystem players, to take over this market and redefine the market, right? If you think about the Echo and the Alexa, right? We used to have 3 different markets. We used to have a market for voice control. We used to have a market for smart home controllers. We used to have a market for speakers. And Amazon came in, and post Echo, those 3 things don't make sense as separate markets. Right? That's a totally new construction of ecosystems, right? It's like, we used to have an industry that was focused on MP3 players, and there used to be an industry focused on phones. And those are 2 great industries where people made lots of money and lots of competition happened. And then one day somebody combined the 2, and you look back and you're like, well, why were they ever separate? Right? There's a similar sort of story that is beginning to unfold in healthcare, right? It's not clear what the final equilibrium is. I suspect there are going to be multiple versions of this, but the notion that, you do delivery without some kind of insurance, right? That is becoming a lot. It still happens, but it's becoming more noteworthy, right? Rather than the de facto standard, right? What it is, again, this is kind of, as we're crossing boundaries, that's what the reconfiguration of ecosystem looks like. And in the beginning, it feels like just ecosystem construction, but by the time the construction is done, it feels a lot like offense if you're not the one who drove this, right? You feel like you're on the outside.
What's the unique advantage of established players in this new order?
When people hear the word ecosystem, right, we immediately jump to Silicon Valley and all these exciting startups. And there's a certain falsehood to the notion that this ecosystem story is a startup story, right? So startups are great at imagining the world. But the key to ecosystem success is alignment. And the key to alignment is being able to manage partners into a new position. The huge advantage that incumbents have is existing partner relationships, especially in B2B type settings where trust matters enormously. Being an incumbent, having a history is a huge advantage. So when startups win in that space, it's because the incumbents can't get out of their own way. It's because they can't commit to the realignment that's really necessary. It's because their internal systems are misprioritizing what to do for their own internal benefit versus to get their partners in place. But an enlightened incumbent has a massive, massive advantage in driving ecosystem change. And I would say a coalition of enlightened incumbents is, an even higher level of the game.
Well, getting back to healthcare, we have very large health systems, very large health plans or insurance companies, and one huge regulator and payer in the federal government. There's a lot, three really established types of players here. How does an innovator crack into that whole constellation of these huge companies?
The good news and the bad news, of course, is that it's actually, we say these are the three elements in the healthcare ecosystem, but we know there's at least 51 regulators, right? There's the federal government, and then for better or worse, each state has its own version of what they think healthcare policy is. We know that insurers are not monolithic, and we know that their incentives are changing. And we, particularly in healthcare, right, which is it's a very different business, right? You're not selling cars. Cars are complicated today in a way that they weren't 10 years ago. But healthcare, you're selling something that is somewhere between a privilege and a right, and where that border is itself is being renegotiated. And that renegotiation creates complexity, but it also creates opportunity for finding new configurations, right? So if one state is unhelpful in driving telehealth, that's not a veto on telehealth, right? So we're seeing different states change their mandates. I actually think that the healthcare which itself, of course, from the provider side is not monolithic, has massively underplayed their influence and their ability to shape alignment in the ecosystem, right? I mean, healthcare systems are, they're some of the prime employers in whatever geography they're in, right? That's totally separate from their contribution to community health in the community that they're in. The people who work at healthcare systems tend to participate in, hugely within their communities. And so there are all kinds of levers that can be pulled to put forward a clearer vision and drive alignment. Whether they're pulled or not is something else. And that, again, I think where greater clarity in being able to express the strategy will lead to far greater effectiveness.
Ron, in the book, you talk about the ecosystem trap, Can you describe that for us, please?
Incumbents are advantaged in that they have relationships, but they're disadvantaged in that they have some success. And the ecosystem is what happens. So the ecosystem is the structure of interdependence when you define relationships around this value proposition end goal. An ecosystem is what happens when you define those relationships around a central actor, around yourself. And the ecosystem trap arises when you can't tell the difference between those two things. When you think of yourself as the central actor in the ecosystem, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but if you allow that to blind you to the need to drive alignment around the value proposition, it leads to massive underperformance and huge waste and a lot of time going by without action.
So you mentioned leaders. How do you develop and recruit leaders in this new order?
So usually strategy people don't talk about leadership, right? Not because we don't think leadership is important, but because, we don't have a lot to say other than get better leaders. And the aha for me was that when we're in an ecosystem setting, that is to say, when we're in a setting where we're redrawing connections, the kind of leader you need is not a better leader, but a different leader, right? When things are stable, what you need is, an execution-minded leader. You want someone who puts their organizations ahead of themselves, the sort of thing that we usually celebrate. But if you're trying to align others into a new configuration, someone who puts their organization ahead of everything else doesn't sound really good to any of these other partners. So what you need is not an execution mindset leader. You need an alignment mindset. And that requires a different way of thinking. That requires a different set of trade-offs. And quite frankly, from a governance perspective, it requires an appreciation that the right leader is sacrificing something in the near term to drive alignment that will create returns in the longer term, rather than getting as much as possible for the organization in every period and quarter that we're in.
What about mindset? I mean, is there a different leadership mindset, do you think, going forward?
Yes, I think this is the critical difference between an execution mindset and an alignment mindset, where the alignment mindset puts partners and the need to get them in place, not just the need to shake hands, not just the need to run pilots, but to find a way of getting partners into place in a way that will satisfy them into the long term so you can actually scale. This is this crucial alignment mindset. And it's got certain characteristics that I go into in the book. And that, I think, is the critical difference. It's not a difference of vision. It's not a difference of risk-taking. It's not a difference of investment. It's this difference in having an alignment mindset.
Ron, this has been a terrific interview. Winning the Right Game is going to be a classic for all of us interested in entrepreneurism and innovation and leadership. Two last questions, if I could. We have a number of up-and-coming leaders that listen to this show. What advice do you have for up-and-coming leaders?
I think it's a great question because, we like to tell strategy stories from the perspective of the CEO. Not everybody is the CEO all at once. If you're inside the organization, these principles apply in the same way, but with a different flavor, right? So you can't change the organization strategy, but you can, one, try to understand the organization strategy through this lens. And that will give you a sense for which pilots, which projects that are being started are actually more or less likely to move to scale, right? I think the biggest challenge in healthcare systems today is it's not that we don't have enough new ideas, it's we're drowning in ideas. And healthcare systems are also really good at launching a lot of ideas. And so we're drowning in pilots. And a lot of these pilots are actually successful. And then most of these pilots are successful pilots that then go nowhere, right? If you're early in your career, you want to figure out not which is the exciting pilot, it's which of these pilots is going to go to scale. And the way you want to manage yourself, your team, manage up, manage down, is to make sure that you're aligning things in a way that you can actually move beyond the initial success and the exceptional circumstances that surround any pilot to actually move to something bigger. The advice I give is usually, you put really promising people on a pilot, it's getting a lot of attention, it's getting a lot of resource. So a successful pilot teaches you that something is possible. To see if something is scalable, what you need is your most mediocre people with the kind of neglect they suffer in the day-to-day job. And if that works, now you can scale. And so designing the projects that you have to be, you need the exceptional circumstances to get them started, but then you really need to think about alignment right up front to make sure that they scale and make impact. And that's how you make a difference in the world. And that's also how you make a difference in your career.
The follow-up question there is the same question for innovators, and I suspect that the answer is probably in the same category, but what advice would you have for innovators, Ron?
Yes, it's in the similar vein of there's so much exciting stuff happening in healthcare. And it's very easy for an innovator to get caught up in the shininess of the goal and allow themselves to be a lot fuzzier about the pathway of getting there. Not their own development pathway, but the alignment pathway for bringing things together. And I'd say that's probably maybe one of the most valuable tools and constructs in this book is how do you approach driving that alignment? And so I think in some ways for innovators, it's even more important than for what we usually think of as established incumbents, because they don't have as many resources to take as many swings before they actually connect and get the ball out of the park.
Ron, I enjoyed our conversation. Thanks very much. It was terrific as expected, and congratulations on winning the right game. It's a good one.
Oh, thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I appreciate the chance to share these ideas. I'm very excited about it.